District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This episode is brought to you by Nerds Gummy Clusters, the sweet treat that always elevates the vibe. With a sweet gummy surrounded with tangy, crunchy nerds, every bite of Nerds Gummy Clusters brings you a whole new world of flavor. Whether it's game night, on the way to a concert, or kicking back with your crew, unleash your senses with Nerds Gummy Clusters.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Welcome to a special broadcast of District of Conservation, simultaneously broadcasting on YouTube. We're joined by a very special guest, OJ Oleka, from the State Financial Officers Foundation. We're going to be talking about ESG. Listeners are familiar with environmental, social, and governance posturing because we talk about it as it relates to the government dictating climate and ESG posturing throughout wildlife management decisions, energy production, and the like. And we're here with OJ to get a sense of where ESG is going. OJ, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Gabby. Good to be here.
Briefly introduce yourself. How'd you get roped into fighting ESG, and then go into what SFOF does?
Well, I actually got roped into ESG fighting through SFOF because I was interested in it. Really, to understand the whole perspective, you got to know where I came from. My parents came to this country from Nigeria before I was born. They worked hard. They played by the rules. My parents saved every penny that they could. My dad became a professor, got his PhD. My mother became a labor and delivery nurse. And they got to buy a house in Frankfurt, where I grew up, put me and my sisters through college, and live the American dream. And the reason why that's so important to how I got involved in the ESG is because when I think about our country, I think about greatness. I think about people coming here the right way, legally, people working hard and being able to have the opportunity to achieve whatever God-given dream and whatever God-given talent that they have. But with ESG, particularly the S, which we'll get into in terms of the social part, people say that none of that really matters, that the idea of working hard and having merit as an important part of what you do is irrelevant. So when I had the opportunity to become the Chief Executive Officer for the State Financial Officers Foundation, I took it because what I want to do is push back against these forces from the left that say we should worship at the altar of the climate gods, that we should get rid of merit and instead focus on racial preferencing and outcomes, and that we should force businesses to do things against their interest. I don't want to do any of that because my life says that if you work hard, that if you do the right things, then you can be successful. So that's why I got involved in government and politics to begin with. I spent 4 years working for Treasurer Allison Ball, 3 years as her Chief of Staff, her deputy. So that really got me into the government game, so to speak. I got to really recognize and see how money was spent, how to protect taxpayer dollars against waste, fraud, and abuse. And I got to see ESG from that perspective way back in the day. So I spent some time in the private sector, ran a higher education association, saw the DEI portion there. And again, when I had the chance to fight it all in one place at SFOF, I had to take it because it mattered to me personally. I had seen it professionally, and I had a chance to step in fully in the fight.
And I can personally speak to and attest to the great work that SFOF does because in my professional capacity with Independent Women's Forum, I've gone to several of your guys' events. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And it's helped to educate me about ESG because my first exposure to ESG, and listeners will be familiar with this, is when the debanking movement of the firearms industry first occurred. So to me, that was the perfect contextualization. Yep. Then listeners are also familiar with seeing, like I said, that creeping ESG climate posturing on hunting, fishing, areas where it's not supposed to be politicized.
Right.
And a lot of listeners probably have 401ks, even if they're not directly involved in Wall Street or financial asset management. So people are becoming familiar even outside of the financial space. So to those who are not really so well versed on this, or they're just learning about ESG. What is ESG for dummies, essentially?
Yeah, well, I'll explain it kind of long form because you talked about debanking, and I really want folks to understand how these things are connected. And also, particularly, how one of our treasurers, a former treasurer now, John Schroeder in Louisiana, he was one of the first ones to uncover this. There were banks in his state that were saying we weren't going to do any business with gun manufacturers. And he's like, well, if you're not going to do that, then you're actively saying that you don't care about the Second Amendment. You're actively deciding that these businesses are the reason for gun violence. If that's the instance that you're going to lead with, then we're just not going to do business with you, bank, and we're going to move our money elsewhere. That was a big deal when he did that initially, I think 6 or 7 years ago. And as you said, that was the beginning of ESG. That's also debanking. So these things all go together. And the short version of what ESG is, it's when you have an asset manager, some financial institution, basically people who have control over large funds, deciding that they're going to play ideological politics with the people's money and try to force businesses to engineer social outcomes. So each of the words, E, environmental, again, is the belief that you should make every decision based on a leftist perspective on what the climate is and what it's doing, even though the data don't suggest it. The S is social, and that's DEI all the way. It's this belief that we need to focus on racial preferences, and because of historic grievances, give present-day people preferences over other people for no real reason other than somebody felt bad about it, quite frankly. That's the S. And then you have the G, which is the governance. It means that if your business isn't doing it, if your business isn't forcing people on boards with complete disregard for merit, but focusing on quotas instead, then we're going to pull our funds away from you. It's weaponizing and politicizing the people's money. It's a bad thing. It's an awful thing. And it's one of the reasons why SFOF and our financial officers are fighting against it every single day.
And you see in the outdoor industry, they've largely succeeded in trying to get oil and gas companies to decarbonize, which sounds extremely counterintuitive. Yes. But what I've noticed so far, it has not permeated in Bass Pro Shop, Cabela's, because they're private companies. They're not publicly traded. And I think the heads of those companies don't agree with ESG and kind of this radical posturing. So you don't really see it kind of permeate in outdoors, but they have successfully tried to get into energy, especially conventional oil and gas energy. But now you're starting to see a lot of these conglomerates who were buying into it, but realizing that they're going to be at the chopping block at the end of it if they succeed in decarbonizing. But you can't, because those goals will never be met. As my listeners know, it's only a 0.2 of a degree decrease, and then untold trillions of dollars of economic destruction, and you're not saving the environment.
That's right.
And so people are understanding that, I think. And at first, I think all of us who've been fighting ESG were told, well, resistance, it's this vast right-wing conspiracy, it's only conservatives. But 18 months later, since those proclamations, now they're kind of conceding defeat.
Yeah.
But the battle's obviously not over.
That's right.
So talk about ESG's landscape 2025. We have a new administration. It seems like the private sector is even turning against it.
Yep.
Maybe not necessarily wholly against it, but they're reshifting, not totally abandoning net zero, but they're kind of changing the language. What is your view of that? Why is that?
Well, the reason why is because a lot of folks really weren't for this to begin with. Like, it's largely being pushed by a few big players. You've got the asset managers. BlackRock is the main key player there because they control so many assets. They do so much investment. They've thrown their financial weight around to force people to be involved in so-called care about ESG. And then you had the Biden administration. Because of the full weight and force of the federal government issuing guidelines, making rules, forcing businesses to, again, implement DEI in their business, forcing them to look at ESG investing. Businesses, as they were taught to do when they went to business school, as they had to do when they got employed, they're looking at the markets. So you would hear people say, oh, it's a financial risk if you don't do ESG, or it's an environmental risk in terms of the business environment or the economic risk. Well, it's all because of government.
Yep.
And that's all because of a few big asset managers. So if you change the government, which we did last November, and you see the results of it with the executive orders a few weeks ago and ongoing, well, all of a sudden, a lot of that government risk is gone from an executive perspective. But also, you see courts ruling on this in favor of neutrality, in favor of fiduciary duty. There was a judge in Texas who had a good ruling that said you can care about ESG investing, but you can't make it equal, even, or even above financial returns. To your point, it makes no sense for an oil company to be involved in getting rid of carbon investment. That's literally what you do. You can't be a company like In-N-Out Burger or McDonald's or any company that deals with beef and be in favor of reducing beef consumption because of the carbon output. It makes no sense. It is literally costing your business money, which is the opposite of what you're supposed to do as a fiduciary person. And again, that just means that you're making sure that the interests are to make more money. So things are changing because the governmental environment has changed, and because of that, the market itself is able to shift back to where it wanted to be, which was neutral, to make as much money as possible based on your business.
That's very true, and something we're still having to pay attention to, and I'm not sure how much you're familiar. I know your predecessor and a couple others, we were all very involved in stopping the SEC rule for natural asset companies. I'm sure you're very familiar.
Yeah.
But it really alarmed me that they were wanting to create these entities to trade on the New York Stock Exchange to basically gobble up private and public lands.
Yep.
And I didn't really see much outrage from my fellow sportsmen and women until they were starting to get educated. But they were perfectly fine with it, saying we could use it to our advantage. But it really would have enabled the BlackRocks of the world, perhaps even foreign adversaries, to get control and ownership of these NACs, and then dictate what you can and cannot do, kicking people off public lands, for instance, and then losing that access, which is so precious for multiple uses. And then private people are going to be lumped into this through conservation easements or other types of barriers potentially, and then that land becomes just off limits. And so that did scare a lot of people, but that is still something we have to worry about, the assets, the natural accounting.
That's right.
But people are fending it off slowly but surely, but even that was also very troubling, especially for my audience, because they were learning and they were like, how is this possible? I would lose access under a potential NAC structure? And the government is going to sell it to the BlackRocks of the world? Like, we don't want that.
And what I tell folks is, if the government in D.C. is trying to control it, it's probably a bad idea. And it's a basic question to ask yourself. Who knows better how to deal with the land in your community? You, the people who are hunting, fishing it every single day, or some bureaucrat in Washington who can't even name the town that you're in? I mean, it's pretty much a no-brainer. So for us this year, to go back to your question I did not answer, in terms of what's on the docket in 2025, it is going on offense. As I said, it felt like we were on defense for a while, but now we've got some great new team players, some all-stars in the game, and President Trump and the leadership in Congress and Vice President Vance. And our focus is we're going to ask them to effectively codify a lot of this stuff, the legislation that we think is important, but then also from an executive perspective, let the agencies put out new rules. Say, we're actually going to do rulemaking, we're going to do guidance, we're going to do oversight that says making money for a business is the most important thing that it's supposed to do. You are to respond to your shareholders. You are to make sure that you can be as efficient with customers' dollars, with investors' dollars as you can, and just reinforcing in the rules that fiduciary duty reigns supreme as opposed to ideological investing like ESG.
And this kind of whole of government posturing, which did encompass a lot of climate and ESG notions from the past 4 years, we saw President Trump with the swipe of an executive order. He eliminated much of that, which is very encouraging. So we're not going to see this ESG posturing in any energy-related rulemaking, conservation-related rulemaking. So listeners can be rest assured of that. That's very encouraging. But there's still, like you said, action that has to be codified by Congress, because an EO doesn't really have teeth on its own. It needs to have backing from Congress. I think the ERISA rule from the Department of Labor is one, because that is now law. That is now an official regulation, and a lot of people have seen their 401ks depreciate as a result of that, going in with all these extraneous non-pecuniary factors being considered. So people still have to kind of watch out for that. But you're right, from the regulatory side, we do have champions of freedom who are trying to stave off the influence of ESG, and then hopefully the private sector will follow. But what else is SFOF working on specifically this year?
Yeah, we have a big push with debanking. And again, debanking is when a bank decides that because they don't like your politics, they don't like your faith, they can decide not to do business with you. And I want to kind of separate out the two things, because banks should have the ability to not do business with somebody who's doing something illegal. If you are engaged in some illegal business, you're selling drugs, a bank doesn't have to bank with you even though you have a bank account with them. That makes sense. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the kind of nebulous idea of, quote, reputational risk. As in, Gabby's running a great podcast and she's got to buy a new microphone, so she has a bank account that she can pull funds out to do that. If whatever bank that you're banking with says, well, I don't like this podcast. She had that OJ guy on there. He's got an annoying voice. He's weird. I don't like it. I'm going to get rid of her bank account. That would be a problem. They would say that reputational risk, quote unquote, is reason enough. Or what we're hearing is that they don't tell you why at all. They drop you as a customer. They just decide to do it. And we've really seen this in some pretty significant ways. These have been people who are giving money to charity, giving money to churches. These are people who are giving money to conservative causes in banks, particularly the Bank of America. They have just said, we're not going to do business with you anymore. That is a violation of the First Amendment, in my opinion, depending on how they do it. And the president called this out. We talked about this last year, and the reason why I'm bringing so much detail to it now is because what we want to do this year is make sure that other people know that if this is happening to them, they're not alone. So we launched a national database to get as much stories, as much information as we can from folks all across the country to say, if you've been debanked, if you feel like this has happened to you, tell us. This actually happened to one of our financial officers.
Is that so?
This is an elected official, Andrew Sorrell, the auditor of Alabama. This happened to him 3 different times, and he owns a gun, like a pawn shop that sells guns. It happened to him with his credit card, it happened to him with his bank account. Like, he's gone into detail about this. He's written an op-ed on it. He's an elected official. Mm-hmm. It's happened to Sam Brownback, who is a former ambassador, who's a former governor, who's a former United States senator. Like, the fact that these folks, based on what some middle manager at some bank feels about their politics and their business, can potentially lose it all. We know that it's happening to regular Americans. We've gotten responses from people all across the country. So we're asking people to sign up to do that. That's at SFOF.com. So if that's you and you've been debanked, we want to hear from you because we want to make sure that we can lift your story up to the halls of Congress, to the people who can make these decisions state by state to fight for you.
And where else would you like to send, as we round out this conversation, which has been fantastic, I think very illuminating for those who are wanting to know where ESG stands and groups like yours fighting it. But besides that website, which we will include in the show notes and in every vertical we can, where can people connect with you, SFOF? Please direct all the links you can.
Yeah, again, SFOF.com. And I would say for you, as a listener, look at who the state treasurer or the state auditor or the state comptroller is in your state. Those are the folks that are our financial officers. We've got 38 of them in 29 different states across the country, representing over 170 million Americans. Between the boards they sit on and the funds that they control, over $3 trillion in assets under management. These folks are your elected officials. They're your government leaders. So go to their websites, again, the ones that believe in economic freedom and free markets. Depending on where you are, you may not have a treasurer or auditor that fits in with that, but go to their website, come see us, follow us on social media, and tell us exactly the things that matter to you in terms of how your money's being spent, how you want to see transparency in government, how you want to see efficiency in government, because those are the things that we fight for and that our financial officers fight for every single day.
Well, you know that I am a big fan of SFOF. My listeners are now familiar with you all with this wonderful introduction to you, OJ. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. I hope you come back.
We'll do it.
Maybe we can do quarterly updates to see like what ESG is doing and where it's trending. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing what you guys are up to.
That'd be great. Thanks, Gabby.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.